September. The site for this prestigious event changes from one year to the next between the three countries of Scotland, Wales and England, with the Irish hosting their first international in 1997 on Thurles Racecourse in County Tipperary. The last time the finals were held in Scotland, it was on the green hillside course at Carmichael in Lanarkshire. It was the year that saw the team of Johnny Wilson and Spot claim the title and the winning position for Scotland. The following year, the finals moved to the west coast of Wales and the flat dykelands of Tynecastle Park, close to the fishing town of Aberystwyth. It proved to be a very successful year for Bobby Dyell, winning the Supreme Championship for the second time with Wisp. For 1993, the four teams met on the fields of Armathwaite, a well-known trialling site in the Lake District of England. The final day ended in one of the closest scores for the top two positions. Alistair McRae's run with Nan took the supreme position just 1 point ahead of Paul Turnbull and Knapp. Glyn Owen came out as the highest scoring Welshman in 5th position, with David Lytle and Britt winning the top score for the Irish team and claiming 7th position overall. The Stirling Team Shield was won by Wales, with Ireland in 2nd place. For the 1994 Supreme Championship, we travelled up the east coast of Scotland and into Aberdeenshire. This part of Scotland brings together the strengths of both its livestock production and also its crop production into one of the finest mixed farming areas in the country. If you have the opportunity to travel through the valleys and across the hills and mountains of the region, it would be hard not to notice how this part of Britain has remained quite unspoiled from the busyness that has overtaken so much of the British countryside. The site for this year's trial was the flat valley fields of Monymusk Estate, the home of Sir Archibald Grant. The small village of Monymusk has been well preserved by the estate and remains one of the finest examples of its kind to be found on the east coast. The estate has been in the family since the early 1700s, and at the time it was purchased by Lord Cullen, it was noted as being in considerable disrepair. It is said that Lord Cullen was so disappointed with his purchase that he gave it to his son, Sir Archibald Grant, and it was in his care that the estate flourished. He was known as one of the pioneering Scottish agriculturalists, and it is said that in his lifetime he planted some 50 million trees on his estate. To qualify to represent their countries, each handler has to compete in their respective national finals held in the early autumn months. 15 dogs and their handlers win the right to represent their country for the Supreme Shield and also the Team Shield. At the national finals this year, the Scotsman John McKillop won the top position at the Scottish National with his 5-year-old Don. He was to lead a formidable team consisting of members who had collectively won 6 Supreme, 30 International and over 60 national titles. The Welsh team was led by their national winner, Wyn Organ from Llandeisel, from the county of Dyfed, with his 4-year-old Cap. Winning the captain's position for Ireland was John McGinn with Glen, a 6-year-old son of John McFadden's Glen and his own Floss. Ireland's strong second placing for the Team Shield last year was a great boost for their handlers, and again this year they had put together a team with many of the experienced men that had consistently run the international courses. For the English team, Vic Morris and Mack won through to capture the top position for 1994 at their national trial in Gloucestershire. He headed a strong team made up of such well-known handlers as Paul Turnbull, the reserve Supreme Champion at last year's final, 3 members of the Longton family, Tim, Thomas and Timothy, Raymond McPherson and John Thomas, to name just a few. The 3 days of competition are divided up each year to allow for the 60 qualifying runs, the finals of the International Brace Championship, and the running of the 15 finalists for the Supreme Shield. Also on the Saturday are the finals of the Young Handlers competition, and at the very end of the whole proceedings, the International Driving Championship. The first 2 days of the trial were mostly taken up with the 60 qualifying runs. These started early in the morning and ran through to the late afternoon. The course for the qualifying runs at the International start with an outrun of 400 yards to gather a group of 5 sheep. On the outrun, the dogs can go out on either side of the course for a maximum of 20 points per judge. Once the dog has reached the back of the sheep must be lifted onto the start of the fetch. A maximum score is awarded when the sheep are precisely and accurately lifted from the pick-up point onto the start of the fetch. On the fetch, the sheep must be brought down the course in as straight a line as possible through the fetch gates and onto the handler's post. Once the sheep have reached the handler's post, they must be taken around the handler and onto the start of the drive. The drive is in 3 parts. Firstly, the sheep must be driven away in a straight line to the first set of gates. Once through the gates, they have to be turned tightly around the gates and onto the start of the cross drive. On the cross drive, the sheep have to be driven across the course in a straight line to a second set of gates. Once through these gates, the sheep have to be turned sharply around the gate and onto the final part of the drive back to the shedding ring. Once the sheep have entered the shedding ring, the handler can leave the post to assist the dog in shedding off 2 of the unmarked sheep. The shed must be taken inside the marked area, with the dog coming through and holding the 2 sheep away from the remaining 3 sheep. Once this has been completed, the 5 sheep are then regrouped and taken directly to the pen. At the pen, the handler must hold the 6-foot rope attached to the swinging gate, while the dog works the sheep into the mouth of the pen. Once the pen is completed, the 5 sheep must return to the shedding ring and the single sheep is taken. Here the dog must shed off one of the 2 marked sheep and work it away from the remaining 4 sheep. The handler should not assist the dog in driving off the single sheep. Once the single sheep has been taken, the course is completed. The total score for the course amounts to 110 points per judge and 440 in total for the aggregate of 4 judges, with a time limit of 15 minutes per run. On the start of the first day of qualifying, the first Welshman to compete and the second handler to the post was G.L. Jones with his 4-year-old Bill, a son of Aled Owen's Ben and Roberts's Nell. Through to the shedding ring, very few points were lost. Both the lift and the pen scored top marks from the 4 judges. But more than half the points taking the single were lost with the sheep leaving the shedding ring before the single was actually taken. This dropped his score to 377 points. Johnny Wilson was the second handler in the Scottish team to take to the post. Spot is a son of Raymond McPherson's cap, and John his own Peg. Peg managed to take Johnny to many successes throughout the 1980s, and although never winning an international, she came close on several occasions. This run was the start of a strong showing by the Scottish handlers. The start to Johnny's run with Spot lost him the most points. His outrun was wide and lost some 16 points, with a further 12 points lost on the fetch when the sheep came offline and almost missed the fetch gates. His drive was very steady and on an excellent line, before finishing the course with a high-scoring shed, pen and single. This left them with a final score of 396. John Brennan was the second of the Irish handlers to compete. His 3-year-old Clare is off Sidney Price's Davy and John's own Dell. John comes from Temple Moor in County Tipperary and shares his time between his farm and his profession as a school teacher. The mother of this 3-year-old Clare, John's little bitch Dell, was a frequent partner to John on the national and international trial fields of Britain. After all the successes that John has managed for the Irish team over the years, this year his work with Clare proved to lose him too many points on the drive. The high scoring on the remainder of the course proved that John's teamwork with Clare, who is still only 3 years old, will definitely find him some future successes at the internationals. For this year, the 56 points dropped on the drive brought his score down to 358. Ray Edwards has won a place on the English team on a number of occasions. His 4-year-old Bracken is a son of John Angus MacLeod's Taff and Bailey's Gem. Ray farms at the far end of the country, close to the south coast of England, near the village of Partridge Green in Sussex. Right through the first part of the course, the gather and the drive, Ray and Bracken lost very few points. 16 points were dropped at the pen, and then problems taking the single ended up with Ray running out of time before the single sheep was taken. Even with losing all of his points for the single, he still managed a final score of 354. Bobby Henderson has represented Scotland on a number of occasions. He came to Monymusk this year with his 4-year-old Ross. During the week, this team shepherded the 3,200 acres of hills on Ladyside, a hill farm in Midlothian, carrying some 1,100 breeding ewes and 300 ewe hogs. Ross started nursery trials at 18 months, going on to win the Lanark, Lothian and Peebles Nursery League. Ross is Welsh bred. He was sired by W.G. Jones's Mac, and on his mother's side Robert's Jill from Allard Owen's breeding of Lille and his well-known Ben. Bobby was the 9th competitor of the day, finishing up with a second highest score so far on the Thursday with a 386, 10 points behind Johnny Wilson's run with Spot. Alistair McRae came to the International this year to defend his championship title. He had managed to qualify 2 dogs at the Nationals this past autumn, his 4-year-old Nan and then his 2-year-old Ben. Ben was one of the youngest dogs to qualify for this year's International. His breeding goes back to Roddy McDermott's Cap and Kay Wood's Queen. By the time he completed the course, Ben had managed a fairly consistent run, but still a total of 63 points had been lost, bringing his final tally to 377, a score that would prove short for a chance at the Supreme. Glyn Howells was the 4th member of the Welsh team to run on the first day of qualifying. The highest score from any of the Welshmen so far was the 377 from G.L. Jones at the beginning of the day. Glyn had qualified with his 6-year-old Cass, a son of J.R. Jones's Don and L. Dean's Maid. It was the fetch that proved to be so costly, with the ewes running to the right-hand side of the course and then breaking to the left before the fetch gates. This lost him 37 of the possible 80 fetch points from an otherwise high-scoring run, ending up with a final total of 374 points. Dennis Birchall, who farms near the Wicklow Mountains, has been a familiar face on the Irish team for some time now. His 5-year-old Jan is from his own breeding of Toss and Mist. Dennis has had many successes on the trial field, including the Irish National Championship in 1985 and the Irish Brace Championship in 1982, 83 and then again in 1985. His final score of 378 was to be just off the mark for a chance at the Shield on the Saturday. J. Marsh came to this year's trial with his 9-year-old Jet, the son of John Thomas's Don and Ray Edwards' Bet. John Thomas's Don's breeding goes back to his well-known and successful Craig, a sire of many winning dogs, himself a Supreme Champion in 1977. The team of John Thomas and Don won the English National Shepherds Championship in 1984 and represented England in 3 successive years on the international field. This run with Jet proved to be the highest scoring run for the English team so far, and although losing heavily at the pen, with one of the ewes breaking away twice, he still managed a final score of 382 points. Jock Welsh and his 4-year-old Craig were the first to run for the Scottish team on the Thursday afternoon. Jock had managed to qualify 2 dogs for this year's international, Craig and Dave from the breeding of Bobby Dial's Wisp on Craig's side and Dryden Joe on Dave's side. The dam of both these dogs was T.M. Hutchinson's Jen. The run with his first dog, Craig, proved to be the high scorer with a final mark of 394, a score that would be well suited for a chance at the Supreme Shield on the final day. His run with his 6-year-old Dave ended up with a score of 363. The year the International was held at Carmichael in Lanarkshire 3 years earlier, John Lightfoot had managed a strong victory at the Welsh National with his 7-year-old Black. He had also managed to qualify another of his dogs that year, his 4-year-old Moss. At this year's finals, he had managed to qualify his 3-year-old Jet, of Sidney Price's Ben and John Chamberlain's Meg. His run this year was consistent right the way through to the single. Unfortunately, the attempt at shedding the single lost John nearly half of the 40 points, dropping his final score to 378. Raymond Macpherson had represented the English team on many occasions, and his successes over the years of trialling are numerous. His best known work was with Zach, the winner of the Supreme Championship in 1975, and then again in 1979. At this year's International, he had qualified his 3-year-old Darwin Chips, a son of Glyn Jones's Taff, and Barbara Hamer's Darwin Nan. His 381 final score was much to do with a flawless final part of the run, with no points lost through the last part of the course, the shed, the pen and the single. The 381 was to prove to be just sufficient to squeeze in for a chance at the Supreme Shield on the final day. "32 handlers and dogs competed on the first day of qualifying, with Johnny Wilson's run with Spot topping the scores with 396. The 386 of Bobby Henderson and Ross was also to prove sufficient to qualify, as was also the 382 of J. Marsh and Jet. Jock Welsh's score of 394 with Craig and Raymond Macpherson's run close to the end of the day qualified both of them for a run on the Saturday. The start of the second day of qualifying trials was delayed early on the Friday morning as the mist in the valley passed through, allowing the course to become visible once again. Marion Jones with his 3-year-old Mac were the first of the Welsh team to compete on the Friday morning. Marian's successes have reached back over nearly 50 years of trialling, and to date has over 2,000 awards to his credit. He started his trialling in 1945 at the age of 12, learning his skills from his father, who won the Supreme Championship 10 years earlier. Among his triumphs, Marian has managed to win the Supreme twice, the International Farmers' Championship on 4 occasions, and 2 International Brace Championships. Marian farms 160 acres in North Wales, where his collies work a flock of 400 half-bred ewes and a herd of 60 suckler beef cows. His young dog Mac, a purchase at a sheepdog auction, and this year's partner at the International, took Marian to the winner's position at the Astor Food and Farming Festival in Hyde Park, when Mac was a mere 20 months old. His breeding goes back to J.W. Dobson's Craig and Nell. His run in this year's qualifying trial ended up with a score of 369 points, losing too many at the start of the fetch, with the sheep badly offline before correcting in time for the fetch gates. Hartford Logan has a history of trial successes, winner of the Irish national trials some 5 times, and when farming in Scotland managed that country's national championship in 1981 and the International Driving Championship in 1980. Hartford has now retired to his native Ireland and runs a small farm in the outskirts of Belfast, where he raises blue-faced Leicesters and Scottish black-faced sheep. His dogs are a main part of his retirement, and this year he qualified to represent Ireland with his 6-year-old dog Dick, a dog of his own breeding of Mickey and Jean. This proved to be another successful year for Hartford in the qualifying trial. His run with Dick proved to score well, finishing up with some 58 points lost and a total for the day of 382. Timothy Longton continues many years of trialling history. His father, Tim Longton, has had one of the most successful careers for the English team and won the Supreme Shield in 1966 with Ken. Timothy has had a number of successes of his own over the last number of years, winning the English National Brace Championship titles in 1988 and again in 1990. At this year's trial, he qualified with his young 2-year-old Rob off his own cap and out of his father's well-known bitch Becca. This was to prove to be a grand run for Timothy and Rob, losing very few points through the whole course, ending up with a final total of 384. Arian Morgan has represented his country of Wales at the international level on several occasions. In 1992 he managed a grand performance at Aberystwyth and then qualified in 4th position at last year's Welsh National with his young dog Smotten. Arian is the 3rd generation of his family to compete in sheepdog trials. He lives on his father's farm just outside the town of Aberystwyth, but occupies his days at his butcher's shop, a profession that reaches back over 100 years in their family. In his spare time he works and trains his dogs on the Welsh ewes and Welsh black cattle that graze his father's farm. For this year he was back again with Smotten, trying for another attempt at the Supreme Shield. Arian's run with Smotten scored well, losing few points throughout the course. It was the last part of the course that dropped his score, when 8 of the possible 40 points were lost at the penning, with one ewe breaking away around the pen. A further 9 points went on the single, ending the run with a final score of 386, the best score so far on the second day. Tim Longton and Becker are no strangers to the international field. Last year at Armathwaite he qualified for both the singles and also the brace finals with Becker. And although this team missed competing in 1992, in 91 at Aberystwyth they once again represented England in both the singles and also the brace finals. Becker is now 7 years old and is off Beddoes Chips and out of Beeman's Becker. The final tally for this run was 395, scoring perfectly in the final parts of the run, the shed, pen and the single. Most of the points that were lost came when the ewes came offline on the start of the drive, with some 24 points lost on the drive in total. John Templeton's career in trialling and with his border collies reached back over several decades and many successes. From his farm near Fenwick in Kilmarnock, he has continued to train some of the most outstanding dogs to have run on the national and international trial fields. His famous Roy managed to qualify for the Scottish national team 9 times in succession. This year is the 29th year that John has represented his country at the international. The 7-year-old Don that John ran this year goes back to the same breeding line that John started with in his teenage years, with Roy as his sire and out of John Templeton Jr.'s Nell. By the time the single was taken, John had lost some 61 points, leaving this team with a final score of 379. Thomas Longton came to the International this year with Pam, a 5-year-old bitch from the breeding of J. Palmer's Sam and Jan. Although the run proved to have no major problems, the points that were lost dropped his final score to 376, too few to qualify for the Saturday's finals. At last year's International, Alistair McRae's run with Nan managed to clench the Supreme Shield, narrowly edging out the fine run of Paul Turnbull and Knapp by 1 point. 4-year-old Nan is off Kenny Bramer's Craig and W. McAllister's Fly. This proved to be the highest scoring run of the 2 days of qualifying, with a final total of 404, losing only 9 points per judge out of the possible 110 awarded for the complete course. Bobby Dial has been a frequent competitor with Wisp in the past number of years. This year, he won the Scottish Shepherd's Championship with his 3-year-old Jim, placing him 3rd overall in the Scottish National. This 3-year-old Jim is a son of Glyn Howell's Jock, and out of Glyn's Cass. Glyn and Jock qualified for the Welsh team in 1991, with his breeding going back to that of John James's Ben and his own Jet. Jim stopped short on the outrun, which lost Bobby 26 of the possible 80 points, but went on to recover well through the remainder of the course, with a perfect scoring lift, shed, pen and single, and only losing 12 of the possible 120 points on the drive. This left Bobby and Jim with a final score on the second day of 396, and the second highest score so far on the Friday. Gwyn Jones qualified with Daviston's Kirk, the previous time the International was held in Scotland in 1991 at Carmichael. This year, Gwyn ran Kirk at the Welsh Nationals to claim 3rd place. His breeding goes back to D. Nichols Daviston's Jit and David Guild's Tweed. Tweed was a rough-coated dog that worked black-faced ewes and Angus cows in Ayrshire. With David Guild as his partner, Tweed went on to win the Scottish Farmers' Championship in 1984 and the Scottish Driving Championship 3 years earlier in 1981. Tweed was always considered a first-class breeding dog, with his own breeding lines going back to Whiston Cap, Templeton's Cap and John Gilchrist's Spot. The 36 points that were lost on the drive were made up by an otherwise first-class run, finishing the course with a perfect shed, penning and single, and enough to find him a place on the final day. The past couple of years has been most successful for Paul Turnbull, and his 9-year-old Nap. Winning the English National in 1993, coming a close second at the International Yarmouth Straight last year, and then winning the Champion trial throughout this past summer. His success was not to be continued in this year's qualifying trial, using up valuable time in the shedding ring, only to run out of time taking the single sheep. Another top handler, Michael Shearer, also lost too many points with his 8-year-old Mist, dropping some 25 on the outrun, leaving him with a final score of 374, not enough to find him a spot on the final day. This year's Welsh team was made up of many national and supreme champions. Owen Daniel, who farms the hills above Ostraginlis, is just one of these handlers. His trialling successes reach back over some 40 years, with his high point of his career winning the Supreme in 1960 at Blackpool with Ken, and then coming second at the Supreme in 1968 with Chip, a son of his 1960 champion. The breeding line on these two dogs went back to Chip, Owen's father's double Supreme champion. His qualifying dog for this year was his 8-year-old Fly, a daughter of Dryden Joe and Dee Jones's Nell. Owen and Nell have represented the Welsh team on 5 occasions at the Supreme Championship trial. For the most part, Fly managed to work the ewes well around the course, but lost some 24 points on the drive, with the ewes coming offline and almost missing the drive gates. By the end of the run, they had managed to lose only a few more points before finishing up with a final score of 384. The last run on the second day of qualifying was Vic Morris and Mac. This pair had won the English National at North Leach in August, and so came to Monymusk with the added responsibility and pressure that comes from winning the National. Vic has been trialling for some 9 years now, but uses his dogs every day on his family's farm on the English-Welsh border in Shropshire. Mac was bred from Fly, one of his own bitches, and was sired by the late W.D. Jones's Mac. This was the second year that Vic had managed to qualify Mac for the English team. Mac started his run with a perfect scoring outrun and lift, losing only 13 points on the fetch. 8 points were lost at the shed and the single, but with a final score of 401, Vic and Mac had secured a position to compete for the Supreme Shield. The runs on the second day looked like this. Tim Longton's score of 395 with Becker was the first of the top runs of the day, but soon afterwards Alistair McRae's run with Nan, the defending champion, managed the highest scoring run for the 2 days of qualifying with 404. Vic Morris's score of 401 was the second highest score of the qualifying trial, and made him the only national winner to qualify for the final day. The finals of the International Brace Championship are held at noon on the Thursday and Friday of the qualifying trials. Here, 2 handlers from each of the 4 countries compete for the championship position. In 1992, John Griffith with Sweep and Moss, 2 dogs of his own breeding, managed to claim victory for Wales with a final score of 477. Last year on the hillside course at Armathwaite, John Griffith once again managed to claim the Brace Championship Shield, the 2nd year in a row, with the same 2 homebred dogs, Sweep and Moss. The reserve championship position went to Tim Longton with Glenn and Becker with 422, and in 3rd position was the English national brace champion, Robin Dean with Dave and Nip. The first handler to compete on the Thursday was Ewan Strachan with his 2 dogs, Chance and Glenn. Chance was sired by John Angus MacLeod's Taff and is out of Donald's Tot, with Glenn coming from Ewan's own breeding of Rye and Bess. Here both dogs arrived at the back of the sheep at much the same time before lifting the ewes onto the start of the fetch. The drive was the most costly part of the course for Ewan, but still ending up with a final score of 464. Colin Gordon has been a regular competitor in the brace finals for the Welsh team over the years. This year, his problem started with one of his dogs crossing the course, and both of the dogs finishing up behind the sheep coming from the same side. His final score of 319 was the result of a disappointing day for Colin. Michael Kelly was the first of the Irish handlers to compete in the brace finals with his Nell and Lad. His final score of 450 put him some 14 points behind the earlier run of Ewan Strachan. Chris Todd came to the finals as this year's reserve English brace champion. He farms Swaledale ewes and beef cows on the fells of West Cumbria. His 2 dogs, Pat and Belle, are 5-year-old litter sisters of John Harrison's Craig and his own Floss. This was the final run on the first day, finishing the course with the highest score of the day at 479. On the Friday, Pat McGettigan was the first to take to the post. Pat has represented Scotland on many occasions, and his homebred Sable and Todd seem to have become a regular fixture on the Scottish team, representing their country on 3 of the last 4 occasions. But it was not to be a winning year for Pat, with one of his dogs crossing over on the outrun, and then narrowly missing the fetch gates. His final score came to 326 points. John Griffith, with his 2 dogs Sweep and Moss, have won the Brace Shield for the past 2 years. John's work with his dogs extends to teaching courses on dog handling at the local agricultural college. On his home farm outside Talasan, John runs a flock of 350 half-bred ewes, but also spends part of each day on his milk round delivering to the nearby villages. John's success at running the brace courses extends back over many years. His run again this year scored well, but points were lost when the ewes left the first pen before the second pen had been completed. John had to then repen the first group before attending to the final pen. This lost John some 20 points, leaving him with a final score of 459. Pat Byrne Jr. has become a regular competitor at the International. He came to Monymusk this year as the Irish Brace Champion, a position he also won in 1991. His two dogs, Star and Dot, are the same two that he won with the past time, and so, like most of the other brace teams, Pat had the experience to make a top run. And so it was to be. His run was to prove easily the best of the day, and by the end of the run he had lost very few points. It is seldom that the brace finals ever gets to see such a fine run and high score. When Thomas Longton came to the post as the final competitor in the brace competition, only the very best of runs could tumble Pat Byrne from his lead. Thomas's successes in the brace competition have won him several English national championships, and this year he managed once again to take this award with his two dogs Pam and Fern. His final score of 4:21 was to place Thomas in 6th place. The Saturday morning brought the 15 finalists together for the day's trial for the Supreme Championship. The course for the Supreme started with an outrun to the left-hand side of the field to gather the first group of 10 sheep, some 800 yards away. Once the sheep had been lifted, then they were brought down the course, through the fetch gates and onto the post, 25 yards through the gates. The fetch gates were set 9 yards apart in the centre of the field. Once the sheep had reached the post, the handler could then redirect the dog for the second group of sheep, 800 yards away, on the right-hand side of the course. Once the dog had reached the second group of sheep, they had to be brought down the course and through the same fetch gates to the fetch post. At this point, the two groups were regrouped for the remainder of the run. Once all 20 sheep were regathered, they had to be brought down the course to the handler's post and then driven off to the right-hand side of the course onto the start of the drive. The drive was in 3 parts over a triangular course of 600 yards. The sheep were first driven away to the right-hand side of the course. Once through these gates, the sheep had to be turned for the cross-drive. Once through the cross-drive gates, the sheep were then brought back to the shedding ring. The shed had to be made in a ring 40 yards in diameter. In the shed, the 15 unmarked sheep had to be shed off from the 5 marked sheep. This had to be done in the boundaries of the shedding ring. If any marked sheep left the boundaries of the ring and joined any of the unmarked sheep, the marked and the unmarked sheep that they had joined had to be brought back into the ring for re-shedding. Until the 15 unmarked sheep had been shed off, penning was not allowed. Once shed, the 5 marked sheep had to be driven by the dog to the pen and worked into the pen. The handler was not allowed to assist the dog in taking the sheep to the pen. The pen was 6 foot by 9 foot with a 6-foot rope attached. Once the handler reached the pen, he had to stand at the pen holding the rope while the dog worked the sheep into the pen. Once the ewes had entered the pen, the gate was closed and the course was completed. The point score for the Supreme was 20 points for each outrun, 10 for each lift and 20 for each fetch. This amounts to a grand total of 100 points per judge for the 2 gathers. The score for the drive was 40 points, the shed 20 and the pen 10. No points were awarded for either the shed or the pen when either of these parts of the course were not completed. The total score for the run was 170 points per judge, and an aggregate for the 4 judges of 680, with a 30-minute time limit. The 15 finalists that qualified to compete for the Supreme Shield were as follows. Of the 15 handlers and dogs, 6 were from Scotland, 5 from England, 3 from Wales and 1 from Ireland. With Johnny Wilson's run called off when the sheep were poorly placed on the second gather, it would be Bobby Henderson and Ross that would be the first to complete. Bobby had qualified with 386 points. Although quite a few points were lost on the first gather, it was the problems in the shedding ring that proved to be the most costly for Bobby. With 4 ewes to be shed, the bell went for time, and so no score was awarded for either the shed or the penning, finishing up with some 235 points deducted and a final score of 445. Jay Marsh came to this year's International with his 9-year-old Jet, off Thomas's Don and out of Ray Edwards' Bet. They came into the final day qualifying with a score of 382. This was a disappointing run, losing many of the points on both the outruns, and then missing the fetch gates with the second group of ewes. The drive also proved costly, with the ewes failing to complete the cross drive before turning and coming back to the shedding ring. His final score with Jet was 410 points. Jock Welsh came into the final day after a high-scoring qualifying run of 394 on the Thursday. His 4-year-old Craig is a son of Bobby Diell's Wisp and Hutchinson's Jen. Problems for Jock on the second gather lost most of the points scored for this part of the course. Then, with difficulties in the shedding ring, with the shed ewes regrouping with the marked sheep, Jock eventually ran out of time with 5 ewes left to shed. So with no points scored for either the shed or the pen, his final score dropped to 362. It was now time for Johnny Wilson to have his rerun with Spot, a son of Raymond McPherson's Cap and Johnny's winning bitch, Peg. Johnny came by his interest in shepherding and sheepdogs in an honest way. His father was also a shepherd and encouraged Johnny with his work with his border collies, starting his first dog, Bess, in 1968. But it was with his next dog, Scott, in 1974, that he went on to win the shepherd's title on the double gather. In 1980, little Peg came along, and in 1984, Johnny and Peg managed to qualify for the Scottish team, scoring well enough to find a place on the final day. Somehow, Johnny and Peg continued to miss winning the Supreme, being runner-up in 1986 and then again in 1987, and then finishing third in 1989. After Peg died, Johnny began having greater success with Spot, a son of his famous Peg, coming second at the Scottish Nationals and seventh at the International in 1990, going on to win the International in 1991 at Carmichael. This run with Spot proved to set the pace for all the other handlers for the rest of the day. Only 109 points were dropped throughout the whole course, bringing his final score to 571. The 381 score that Raymond McPherson managed with Darwin chips on the first day of the qualifying narrowly edged him into the Supreme Championship on the final day. His final score on Saturday of 406 showed the difficulties that Raymond had putting chips out on the second gather. Then with a poor line on the fetch, the sheep missed the gates, losing a further 57 points on the second fetch. Hartford Logan has qualified to run for his country of Ireland with his 6-year-old dog, Dick, on a number of occasions. Dick is off his own breeding of Mickey and Jean. He came into the final day with a qualifying score of 382 points, but it was to prove to be a disappointing day for this team. Right at the start, things went amiss with Dick crossing over on the first outrun, and then going on to miss the gates on the first fetch. Problems at the end of the course ran Hartford out of time and left him with a final score of 314 points. Timothy Longton suffered some of the same problems that Hartford had, with his 2-year-old Rob crossing over on the first outrun. Although a fairly good line was held on the fetch, the sheep missed the gates, and so a further 43 points were lost, ending his run with a final score of 344.
Well, time has run out for Timothy Long.
Arian Morgan and Smarton managed a good run through to the shedding ring. With the ewes pressing to regroup during the shed, Smarton eventually decided to exert his power with a grip, ending in a call of disqualification. Tim Longton had qualified for the final day with his 7-year-old Becca and a score of 395. Unfortunately, his run for the Supreme Shield on the Saturday was not as successful. Right at the start of the run, there were problems on the first gather, losing all but 4 points on the outrun, and then 3/4 of his points on the first fetch. With some 331.5 points lost through the run, his final score ended up at 348.5. John Templeton came into the finals with a qualifying score of 379 and in the 15th spot. His 7-year-old dog Don is a son of his famous Roy. Don took the first gather well, with one redirection on this first outrun, dropping his score some 16 points, 4 points per judge. His good line on the fetch scored him top marks, but with some difficulty in putting Don back for the second group of ewes, cost this run another 52 points. A further 51 points were lost on the drive, with John misjudging the cross-drive gates and turning the ewes too early to come back to the shedding ring. John completed this course with a top-scoring shed, but with the ewes breaking away at the pen, another 17 points out of the possible 40 were lost. This ended up with a final score of 516, the second highest score so far on the final day, 55 points behind Johnny Wilson's run with Spot. Alistair McRae and Nan won the Supreme Shield at Armathwaite last year and came into the final day with the highest scoring qualifying run. Nan goes back to the breeding of Kenny Bramer's Craig and W. McAllister's Fly. Alistair's run was fairly consistent right through, but lost nearly half his points, having difficulty sending Nan back for the second group of sheep. His difficulties really showed up in the shedding ring, with the ewes leaving the ring several times. The remaining 2 sheep took a lot of time before they were successfully taken off, and with the ewes in the mouth of the pen, the bell for time sounded and the run was over. It was strange to see Bobby Dyell at the International without Wisp, but for this year he qualified his 3-year-old Jim, off Glyn Howell's Jock and Cass, and going back to John James's Ben on the sire's side. This run was to prove very consistent, with no major problems except for some redirection on the second outrun, which cost quite dearly. The final score of 5:43 showed the small difficulties encountered right through the run. Even in the last moments of the run, one of the ewes broke past the pen, losing Bobby another 19 of the possible 40 points. Gwyn Jones came to Monymusk having won 3 Supreme titles to his name. He was part of a strong Welsh team bolstered by the performance of 2 former Supreme champions and other handlers that had won some 5 International Farmers Championships, 4 International Brace Championships and a number of Welsh national trophies. The strength of the Welsh team is always so evident, having won 3 of the team shields over the past 4 years of international competitions. As this run unfolded with Davison's Kirk, Gwyn was lining up a top-scoring international run. Only 23 points were lost out of 200 on the first gather to the handler's post. The second gather went well with a few points dropped on the second fetch. But Gwyn's problems really started in the shedding ring. At the very start he managed an excellent first shed of 7 ewes, but then difficulties with the remaining sheep consumed so much time the bell eventually sounded, and so all of the penning and shedding points were lost, finishing up with a final score of 474. Owen, Daniel and Fly came to Aberdeenshire from his hill farm in South Wales. Fly is the daughter of the past Supreme Champion Dryden Joe. This team of Owen and Fly had managed to win the Welsh National in 1992 at Newport in Gwent. Just as with Gwyn Jones's run, Owen managed a good first gather, losing very few points, but then dropped 28 of the possible 80 from having to redirect Flies several times on the second outrun. A poor line on the first part of the drive and then dropping too low on the cross drive and in turn missing the cross drive gates cost Owen 64 of the possible 160 points for this part of the course. There were 17 minutes remaining at the start of the shed. A good first shed led into some difficulties with one of the marked sheep leaving the ring with some of the unmarked ewes. This led to losing more than half of the shedding point before the final 2 sheds took Owen to the pen. A perfect pen finished the run for a total of 493.5, placing him in 5th position with just 1 run remaining. Vic Morris and Mack scored 401 in the qualifying trial, the only other competitor to reach the 400 except for the run of Alistair McRae and Nan at 404. Mack and Vic's other dogs worked the 750 Welsh mule ewes and 70 crossbred Limousin beef cows that make up the Morris's family farm in the Clun Valley in Shropshire. The first part of Vic's run with Mac, right through to the start of the drive, scored the highest over all the other handlers on this part of the course. Only 33 of the possible 400 points were dropped, and so a great start to the run. Unfortunately, nearly half of the points on the drive were lost when the sheet came too low and missed the cross-drive gates before turning for the final part of the drive back to the shedding ring. With all the problems that had been experienced in the shedding ring, Vic managed a great shed, taking the U's off in 3 groups, only bettered by John Templeton's perfect score. Once the 5 U's were left, it was over to the pen and a perfect pen, finishing up with a final score of 564, only 7 points behind Johnny Wilson and Spot. And so, with all the runs completed for the Supreme Championship, the finals of the Driving Championship was held, while the final scores were worked out and rechecked. Using the U's that had been worked during the Supreme, here's the International Driving Championship winning run with Raymond McPherson and his 3-year-old Darwin Chip of Glyn Jones's Taff and Barbara Hamer's Nan. Here are the final placings for the 1994 International. The winner of the Supreme Shield was Johnny Wilson and Spot, with Vic Morris and Mac in the reserve championship position. The Sterling Team Shield was won by Scotland, with England the runners-up. The Brace Championship was won by the young Irishman, Pat Byrne, with Star and Dot. And Raymond McPherson won the International Driving Championship with 3-year-old Darwin Chip.